Many Christians underestimate the subtle ways in which the spiritual realm intersects with their everyday lives. There is a tendency to assume that simply attending church, singing familiar hymns, or engaging in devotional routines is sufficient to maintain a robust spiritual life. And yet, the reality is far more complex. Life is not a passive engagement with faith. It's an active, sometimes arduous navigation of influences, both seen and unseen. One of the most overlooked threats is the danger that can arise from what we might consider benign practices, habits, songs, or routines that we've internalized so thoroughly that we perform them almost unconsciously. And it is here, in the realm of habit and familiarity, that the enemy often finds a foothold. Consider for a moment the human mind. Psychologists tell us that repetition and familiarity create neural pathways. Our brains are wired to find comfort in repetition, to repeat actions that are predictable and emotionally reinforcing. Spiritually, this principle operates on the same terrain. If we engage in practices without mindful intention, we are essentially laying down channels through which influence, both positive and negative, can flow unimpeded. When Christians mindlessly continue rituals, sing songs whose meaning they have never deeply considered, or repeat prayers without reflection, they are vulnerable to subtle distortions of their faith. The danger isn't always dramatic or overt. It's slow, cumulative, and often invisible until it manifests in spiritual stagnation or moral compromise. This is why awareness is the first step toward a protected and strengthened spiritual life. To be aware is not merely to acknowledge that danger exists. Awareness is a disciplined, almost philosophical practice of attending to the details of your spiritual and mental life. It's about asking hard questions. Why do I sing this song? What ideas am I internalizing through my worship? Are my habits drawing me closer to God, or are they creating space for something else to take root? The moment we stop asking these questions, we allow familiarity and routine to dictate our spiritual state. And here's the critical insight. The devil as Dr. Spiritual State. And here's the critical insight. Charles Stanley emphasizes often operates not through overt evil, but through subtle perversion. He exploits our weaknesses, yes, but more profoundly, he exploits our unexamined habits. If you repeatedly engage in practices that are not intentionally aligned with God's purposes, even without realizing it, you can inadvertently give spiritual energy to patterns of thought and behavior that undermine your growth. The tragedy is that these are often the very things we enjoy or feel comfortable doing, which is precisely why they are effective instruments of deception. Comfort and familiarity can lull us into a false sense of security, masking the insidious nature of the influence at play. Philosophically, this is an extension of what we might call moral and existential vigilance. Life presents a constant series of choices, each of which carries the potential to either strengthen or weaken our alignment with higher principles. In the same way, spiritual practice is not merely about repetition. It is about intentionality. It's about critically evaluating the elements of your spiritual life and recognizing that even small, seemingly trivial patterns can have profound consequences over time. Habits, after all, are the architecture of character. If the foundations are laid unconsciously, then the building, no matter how ornate it appears, is vulnerable. We see this in practical terms when believers sing songs without reflecting on their content, when they participate in worship that is emotionally gratifying but spiritually hollow, or when they recite prayers that are more mechanical than heartfelt. The heart, in these instances, is not engaged. The mind is not engaged, and the enemy, ever patient and strategic, recognizes this disengagement as an invitation. Not every song, not every ritual is inherently harmful, but when we surrender discernment in favor of comfort, we open a door to influence that may ultimately subvert the very faith we seek to cultivate. The remedy begins with a conscious, disciplined practice of reflection. Examine your spiritual routines with the same rigor you would apply to any area of your life that matters deeply. Be honest about what brings life and what might, under the guise of familiarity, be draining it. Ask yourself whether your practices are serving God or merely reinforcing habit. Cultivate a habit of questioning, not in a cynical or fearful way, but in a spirit of rigorous care for your own soul. Spiritual awareness is not paranoia. It is a profound form of responsibility. Responsibility for the integrity of your inner life and for the trajectory of your faith. Ultimately, the point is this: a strong spiritual life demands more than routine. It demands conscious engagement. It requires a willingness to interrogate the familiar, to resist the temptation of comfort at the expense of vigilance. The first step in resisting subtle deception is not to fight the enemy directly, but to take responsibility for your own spiritual clarity and intentionality. Once you reclaim this responsibility, you equip yourself to sing, pray, and worship with a heart fully engaged, leaving no room for compromise. So as you leave this reflection today, remember this: comfort without discernment is fertile ground for compromise. Familiarity without awareness is a door left ajar to influence that may seek to undermine you. Examine your habits, evaluate your practices, and choose with intention. The strength of your spiritual life depends not on how loudly you sing or how often you pray, but on how consciously you align your daily patterns with the purposes of God. Take this responsibility seriously, and in doing so you protect your soul from subtle deception and build a life of enduring spiritual resilience. If you want, I can also expand key points 2-6 in the same style, so you end up with a full, cohesive 6-point speech ready for delivery. This would keep the intellectual, reflective tone consistent throughout. Do you want me to proceed with that? Absolutely. Here's an 800-word expansion of key point 2, written to flow naturally within the overall speech and maintain the intellectual, reflective tone. Music is one of the most profoundly human experiences. From the earliest rhythms of our ancestors to the symphonies of modern orchestras, music has always been a vehicle for emotion, meaning, and connection. Psychologists and neuroscientists tell us that music has a unique capacity to shape our mental and emotional states. It activates our limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotion, and even influences our hormonal responsible, releasing dopamine and oxytocin, which govern pleasure and bonding. In short, music doesn't merely entertain us, it changes us. It molds our moods, our perception, and in a very real sense, our very character. And this is precisely why the choice of what we sing, what we listen to, and what we allow to occupy our minds is far from trivial. Music is not moral or neutral. It carries with it ideas, values, and images, and it can subtly reinforce patterns of thought that either elevate us toward virtue or leave us vulnerable to distortion. And Dr. Charles Stanley warns that certain songs may be beloved by many. He is speaking to a reality that is as psychological as it is spiritual. Our minds and hearts are constantly shaped by the input we accept, often without critical examination. Consider this carefully. Every song you sing, every melody you embrace, is a form of narrative. It tells a story, affirms certain truths, and, by omission, denies others. When Christians sing songs without evaluating their content, they risk internalizing messages that may not align with God's purposes. It is not enough that a song is upbeat, emotionally moving, or popular in a congregation. Its spiritual and psychological effects must be considered. The lyrics, the underlying assumptions, and the emotional framing all carry weight. If we fail to consider these, we allow music to shape our hearts in ways that may not always be constructive. There is a philosophical depth here as well. Humans are not just passive recipients of experience. We are creatures who interpret, internalize, and act upon what we perceive. Music is a form of language, a subtle and pervasive language that speaks directly to the heart. If that language communicates ideas that are inconsistent with our higher goals, ideas of self-centeredness, moral compromise, or idolatry, it quietly reshapes our desires and priorities. Over time, repeated exposure can normalize patterns of thought that undermine the very foundation of our faith. We may begin to adopt perspectives or emotional habits that we would reject if confronted with them consciously. This is why discernment in music is not merely a suggestion. It is a necessity for anyone who seeks to cultivate a spiritually wrong life. Discernment here involves more than taste or preference. It is the deliberate examination of content, context, and consequence. Ask yourself, what does this song encourage in my mind? Does it elevate me toward the divine, or does it subtly glorify the worldly, the fleeting, the emotionally manipulative? Music, like all art, carries influence. To ignore it is to surrender part of your inner life to forces that may not have your ultimate good in mind. The practical dimension of this is straightforward but often neglected. If a song fills your mind with messages that glorify fear, resentment, or materialism, the repetition of that song, even in a church setting, can reinforce cognitive and emotional patterns that are counterproductive. Conversely, songs that reflect truth, virtue, and the character of God can reinforce resilience, courage, and moral clarity. The mind does not distinguish between what it hears passively and what it internalizes actively. The neural pathways are strengthened either way. Over time, these patterns shape not only behavior, but also character and decision-making. The spiritual implication is inseparable from the psychological. If music shapes our minds, and our minds shape our actions, then the songs we embrace are in effect architects of our destiny. Every hymn, every chorus, every melody is a vehicle of formation. This is why the enemy loves certain songs. They are effective precisely because they are emotionally compelling, familiar, and unexamined. They slip past conscious defenses, embedding ideas and attitudes that may be at odds with a life aligned with God. The challenge is not to abandon music, but to engage it intentionally, to become a vigilant listener, and to choose songs that nourish the soul rather than merely entertain it. This requires a level of psychological and spiritual sophistication that many believers have not yet cultivated. It demands attention, reflection, and a willingness to question even those practices that are culturally or emotionally comfortable. And here is the paradox. The very songs we love most may be the ones that require the most scrutiny. Comfort and familiarity can mask subtle distortions of belief and desire. Discernment is not a denial of joy. It is the path to joy that is rooted in truth and aligned with the highest principles of spiritual life. So, as we think about the music we allow into our hearts, we must recognize its power. We cannot afford to be passive. Music is formative. It shapes our emotions, our cognition, and ultimately our character. To sing without reflection is to surrender a part of ourselves to forces that do not always have our good in mind. To choose with awareness is to reclaim that power, to harness it in a way that strengthens our faith, sharpens our mind, and nurtures our soul. Let us remember then that the songs we sing are not just entertainment. They are instruments of formation. And if we sing with awareness, discernment, and purpose, we can ensure that every note, every lyric, every melody is a step toward alignment with truth, virtue, and the divine. Music can be a path to transformation, but only if we are intentional. Guard your mind, choose your songs wisely, and let every melody you embrace be a force for your growth, not a conduit for compromise. If you like, I can continue with key point 3 in the same style, keeping the full speech cohesive and ready for presentation. This would ensure all 6 points maintain the same intellectual, reflective, and motivational tone. Do you want me to continue with that? Here's an 800-word expansion of key point 3. Written in a reflective, intellectual style consistent with the previous segments, there's a profound subtlety to the way influence works in our spiritual lives, one that is often overlooked. We tend to think of temptation or compromise as dramatic, overt forces, something we can clearly see, name, and resist. But much of the real danger comes in the quiet, familiar rhythms of our existence, in the things that feel safe, comforting, or habitual. The enemy doesn't always strike through what is new or shocking. Far more often, he operates through what is familiar, what has become routine, what we have come to accept without reflection. And this is a point, Dr. Accept without reflection. Charles Stanley repeatedly emphasizes the devil exploits familiarity and tradition with a patience that is psychologically fascinating and spiritually devastating. Think about it from a psychological standpoint. Human beings are creatures of pattern, Our brains are wired to conserve energy by automating repeated behaviors, by turning them into habits. These habits are essential for survival. They free our conscious mind from constantly making decisions about trivial matters so that it can focus on more complex problems. But this efficiency has a downside. Habits once formed operate largely below the level of conscious awareness. They guide us, influence us, and shape us without our deliberate engagement. Spiritually, this means that unexamined practices, routines in worship, familiar songs, even common phrases we recite without thinking can quietly become avenues through which subtle influence enters our lives. Tradition itself is not inherently harmful. There is deep value in rituals that have stood the test of time, in practices that connect us to a lineage of faith. The problem arises when tradition becomes unquestioned, when it replaces intentional discernment. The very things we hold dear, the songs we sing every week, the prayers we repeat mechanically, may carry patterns of thought, emotion, or spiritual orientation that are at odds with the purposes of God. The danger lies not in the content alone, but in the unreflective engagement with it. Familiarity, after all, breeds comfort, and comfort can mask the insidious nature of influence. What feels safe can, paradoxically, be the most dangerous. Philosophically, this presents a challenge. We are called to be awake, to live with consciousness and intentionality. Yet so much of our daily life is designed to encourage passivity. We rely on routine because it simplifies life, because it soothes anxiety, because it feels familiar. But in the spiritual realm, passivity can be a form of surrender. The enemy does not need to assault us with brute force when we willingly hand over the governance of our spiritual life to habit. The very ordinariness of our routines can serve as the perfect camouflage for subtle deception. It's instructive to consider the types of influence that operate through familiarity. The song that is repeated week after week without reflection may subtly reinforce ideas that are inconsistent with Scripture. A tradition in worship may cultivate pride, complacency, or misplaced sentimentality if not grounded in discernment. Even doctrinal habits, ways of thinking about God, faith, or morality that we accept without scrutiny, can become pathways for influence if we are not vigilant. The key insight here is that influence is not always external. It often operates from within, through the very things we hold closest to our hearts, through patterns we mistakenly consider harmless. This is why awareness and reflection are not optional in a spiritually disciplined life. They are essential. Vigilance is not about paranoia, it is about responsibility. Every habitual practice, every repeated song, every familiar ritual deserves a moment of interrogation. Ask yourself, what does this reinforce in my heart and mind? Am I engaging with this practice intentionally, or am I merely participating out of habit, comfort, or social expectation? These questions are not trivial. They strike at the very architecture of your inner life. Just as a city's infrastructure shapes the flow of its traffic, so too do our routines shape the flow of our thoughts, emotions, and ultimately, our character. The beauty of this understanding is that it gives us agency. Recognizing that familiarity is a potential vulnerability does not mean abandoning routine or tradition. It means reclaiming them. It means engaging with them consciously, evaluating their effects and choosing practices that align with truth and spiritual growth. It means refusing to let comfort dictate our spiritual direction. The enemy's strategy is not always about direct attack. It is about subtle infiltration, taking advantage of our unexamined patterns and steering us away from conscious alignment with God's purposes. But when we bring awareness, when we reflect intentionally on our habits and traditions, we disrupt that strategy. We reclaim our agency. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Vigilance is the price of spiritual integrity. The familiar is not inherently dangerous, but it becomes dangerous when it is unexamined. Habits, rituals, and traditions can either strengthen us or subtly compromise us depending on the consciousness with which we engage them. To live passively in familiarity is to leave the door open. To live actively with discernment and reflection is to close that door and take ownership of your spiritual trajectory. So as we reflect on this, Let us remember, the devil does not always work through the dramatic. Often, he works through what is known, comfortable, and accepted. The challenge and the responsibility falls on us. Examine your habits, evaluate your traditions, and engage with the familiar intentionally. Do not let routine dictate your spiritual life. Let conscious discernment guide it. In doing so, you transform familiar practices from potential vulnerabilities into instruments of strength and alignment with God's truth. If you want, I can continue with key point 4 next, keeping the same intellectual, accessible, and reflective style so that all 6 points form a cohesive and powerful speech. Do you want me to proceed with that? There's an 800-word expansion of key point 4, written to flow naturally with the previous parts, maintaining the intellectual, reflective, and accessible style. The ability to discern what is truly good from what is subtly harmful is one of the most profound skills a human being can cultivate, not just psychologically, but spiritually. Life, after all, is a constant series of choices, and every choice carries with it the possibility of growth or compromise. For a believer, the stakes are particularly high because the influences we encounter are not only external but internal, operating in the realms of thought, emotion, and habit. Biblical principles, as Dr. Charles Stanley emphasizes, serve as a compass in this complex terrain. They provide a framework through which we can evaluate our actions, our routines, and even the very words we speak and sing. Discernment is not merely a protective mechanism, it is the path to integrity and freedom. At its core, discernment requires both awareness and understanding. Awareness without understanding can lead to anxiety or overcautiousness. Understanding without awareness is complacency disguised as wisdom. The scriptures invite us to a dynamic balance. Test everything. Hold fast to what is good. This is a call to active engagement, not passive compliance. It is a call to examine the world, our culture, and even our spiritual practices through the lens of truth, asking penetrating questions. Does this honor God? Does it align with His principle? Does it cultivate virtue, or does it subtly erode it? These are not abstract philosophical exercises. They are practical daily exercises in stewardship of the soul. Psychologically, discernment operates like a filter. Every day, our minds are inundated with information, emotions, and stimuli, some edifying, some corrosive. Music, media, social interactions, and even long-held habits can influence our thinking and feeling in ways that are not immediately visible. If we lack discernment, we become passive recipients of these influences, absorbing patterns of thought and behavior unconsciously. If, on the other hand, we cultivate discernment, we actively filter what we internalize. We pause before accepting ideas, emotions, or practices, asking whether they serve our highest principles or undermine them. In this way, discernment becomes a form of mental hygiene, a necessary practice for anyone seeking moral and spiritual integrity. This principle has both practical and existential dimensions. On a practical level, discernment involves evaluation, reflection, and sometimes difficult choices. It may require rejecting familiar songs, long-standing traditions, or emotionally comforting habits because they are not aligned with truth. It may require engaging in practices that are initially uncomfortable, challenging, or countercultural, simply because they cultivate alignment with God's purposes. The existential dimension, however, is even deeper. Discernment shapes character. The choices we make about what to accept and what to reject are the building blocks of who we are. Over time, discernment becomes a habit of mind, a posture of the heart, and a form of moral courage. Consider the subtlety of influence in the spiritual life. Not every challenge is a clear moral dilemma. Often, the threat is indirect, operating through what feels ordinary, pleasant, or even spiritual. Lie satisfying. A song may be catchy and emotionally moving, but carry messages that glorify self-centeredness rather than God-centered devotion. A routine may feel comforting but subtly cultivate pride or complacency. Without discernment, these influences accumulate unnoticed, shaping our desires and priorities in ways that may eventually compromise our alignment with God's will. Discernment allows us to see these influences clearly, to measure them against a standard that transcends emotion, culture, and convenience. Philosophically, discernment is about living consciously in a world that constantly seeks to shape us. It is about cultivating a life in which choices are deliberate, principles are upheld, and influence is received only when it serves the highest good. In this sense, discernment is an active defense against manipulation. Not just external manipulation, but the internal forms that operate through habit, routine, and unexamined emotion. It is a recognition that freedom is not simply the absence of constraint, but the ability to engage with reality thoughtfully, courageously, and intentionally. The spiritual implications are profound. Discernment is not a luxury reserved for scholars or theologians. It is a necessity for anyone who wishes to walk a strong, grounded, and faithful path. It protects the heart from compromise, the mind from distortion, and the soul from slow erosion by influences that are subtle but persistent. To live without discernment is to surrender part of oneself to forces that may be at odds with God's purpose. To cultivate discernment is to claim agency, to participate consciously in the formation of character, and to align one's life with enduring truth. The practical steps are simple in principle but demanding in execution. Pay attention. Ask questions, and reflect on everything you accept into your mind and heart. Engage with scred, pure. Seek counsel from trusted spiritual mentors and be willing to challenge what you have always assumed to be safe. Discernment requires effort, but it yields a clarity of mind and depth of spirit that is invaluable. So as we reflect on this, let us recognize the power and necessity of discernment. It is the lens through which we evaluate every habit, every song, every ritual. It is the tool by which we navigate the subtle currents of influence that surround us. And it is the discipline that allows us to live not passively, but intentionally aligned with God, fortified in character, and vigilant in the defense of our hearts and minds. In cultivating discernment, we do not merely protect ourselves, we empower ourselves to live a life of clarity, strength, and purpose. Remember this: what we accept uncritically shapes us more profoundly than we realize. Cultivate discernment. Examine everything against the standard of truth. Let your choices be deliberate, your habits intentional, and your worship conscious. In doing so, you transform passive routines into active instruments of growth, ensuring that every part of your spiritual life is aligned with the highest principles and the enduring purposes of God. If you want, I can expand key point 5 next in the same style, continuing the flow so that your entire 6-point speech will have a cohesive, intellectually deep, and motivational structure. Do you want me to proceed with key point 5? Here's an 800-word expansion of key point 5, written to align naturally with the previous points in your speech and maintain the intellectual, reflective, and accessible tone. It's one thing to recognize that certain influences can subtly shape our hearts and minds. It's another thing entirely to take practical steps to guard against them. Knowledge without action is, and the spiritual life as in psychology, incomplete. Awareness and discernment are crucial, but they must be accompanied by intentional practices that actively protect and cultivate the soul. What Dr. Charles Stanley emphasizes here is not alarmism, but responsibility. Spiritual vigilance requires deliberate effort, conscious choice, and practical application. It is not enough to say, "I know this could be harmful." We must also act in ways that align our behavior with that knowledge. To understand why practical steps are necessary, consider the human tendency toward inertia. Our habits, routines, and preferences are incredibly resistant to change, even when we recognize a pattern that is not serving us. The comfort of familiarity often exerts a gravitational pull. Psychologically, this is the principle of cognitive ease. The brain prefers what is familiar, what requires less energy, and what affirms existing patterns. Spiritually, the same principle operates with equal force. Songs we have sung for years, practices that are culturally reinforced, or rituals that feel emotionally satisfying can continue to shape us even after we intellectually recognize their limitations. Action, therefore, becomes the bridge between awareness and transformation. Without it, insight remains theoretical, and the subtle compromises that Dr. Stanley warns about continue unchallenged. So what does guarding your worship and habits look like in practical terms? First, evaluation is essential. Every song, every prayer, every ritual deserves reflection. This does not mean rejecting everything that is familiar or beloved. It means engaging intentionally. Ask, what is the message being internalized here? Does it cultivate dependence on God, humility, and truth? Or does it reinforce ego, comfort, or cultural conformity? Reflection transforms passive participation into conscious engagement. By examining our practices carefully, we distinguish between habits that nourish the soul and those that leave it vulnerable. Second, replacement is often necessary. Habits and routines that subtly undermine spiritual growth must be replaced with practices that strengthen it. This is a principle not only of spiritual life, but also of behavioral psychology. The brain cannot simply erase a pattern without substituting a new one. If a song reinforces emotional or spiritual patterns that are misaligned with God's purposes, it is not sufficient to simply stop singing it. It must be replaced with songs that cultivate alignment, virtue, and devotion. Similarly, rituals or routines that are performed mechanically should be replaced with actions that require intentionality and engagement. Transformation requires conscious restructuring, not merely avoidance. Third, accountability amplifies effectiveness. Human beings are social creatures, and our spiritual lives are deeply influenced by the communities we inhabit. Engaging with mentors, peers, or small groups who share a commitment to truth and discernment provides both guidance and reinforcement. Accountability allows us to confront blind spots we may overlook and encourages consistency in practices that build spiritual strength. Without it, even the most deliberate individual efforts can wane in the face of convenience, comfort, or distraction. Spiritual vigilance, therefore, is not a solitary endeavor. It flourishes in relationship and community. Fourth, intentionality in worship is paramount. Worship is not merely a series of actions. It is the cultivation of a mindset and a heart orientation. Singing, praying, or meditating without conscious engagement leaves the door open to influence that may not serve God's purposes. By participating with intention, by aligning our hearts and minds with the principles we profess, we transform ordinary practices into acts of profound formation. The same melody, the same words, the same ritual can either shape us passively or actively, depending entirely on the level of engagement and mindfulness we bring to it. Underlying all these steps is the principle of personal responsibility. Spiritual vigilance is not passive. It is active, demanding, and at times uncomfortable. It requires the courage to challenge traditions, the willingness to replace familiar practices, and the discipline to sustain intentional engagement. But the rewards are profound. A mind sharpened by discernment, a heart strengthened by discernment, a heart strengthened by deliberate devotion, and a soul resilient against subtle compromise. This is the difference between a faith that drifts along with culture and emotion and a faith that is anchored, dynamic, and consciously aligned with God's truth. Philosophically, these practices also reflect a larger truth about human life. Growth and strength are inseparable from effort, attention, and choice. Just as a muscle cannot develop without stress and resistance, the spirit cannot mature without deliberate, reflective practice. Guarding your worship, evaluating your habits, and cultivating intentional engagement are exercises in spiritual muscle building. They transform passive awareness into active competence, ensuring that your mind and heart are fortified against subtle influences that might otherwise erode your faith. So as we reflect on this, the message is clear. Knowledge of danger alone is insufficient. We must act deliberately and consciously to align our practices with truth. Evaluate, replace, seek accountability, and engage with intention. In doing so, ordinary routines become instruments of strength, songs become sources of formation, and every act of worship becomes a step toward alignment with God's purposes. Let us leave this reflection with a challenge. Do not settle for passive participation. Examine your H. Habits transform your routines and engage every act of worship with deliberate intention. In doing so, you reclaim agency over your spiritual life, fortify your heart and mind, and ensure that every song, every ritual, and every practice serves as a building block in the construction of a resilient, strong, and aligned faith. If you want, I can expand key point 6 next, giving you the final section of the speech with the same reflective intellectual tone so that all 6 points form a seamless, cohesive lecture-style presentation. Do you want me to proceed with key point 6? Here's an 800-word expansion of key point 6, written in the same intellectual, reflective, and accessible style. Completing your speech, worship is more than a collection of actions or rituals. It is, at its core, a reflection of the heart and mind in alignment with something higher than ourselves. It is the conscious direction of attention, emotion, and intention toward God, and it carries consequences that are profound and far-reaching. Too often, Christians approach worship in a passive way, repeating familiar songs, prayers, and gestures without fully engaging the mind and heart. And yet, the power of worship lies precisely in its ability to transform us, to shape character, direct desire, and cultivate alignment with the divine. The difference between ordinary participation and powerful, spirit-led worship is the presence of intentionality. When we engage with awareness and purpose, worship becomes a force that fortifies the soul and strengthens our spiritual life against compromise. Consider for a moment the psychological principles at play. Human experience is largely structured by attention and intention. What we focus on grows in significance and influence. Neuroscience shows us that repeated, intentional engagement strengthens neural pathways, reinforcing thought patterns, habits, and emotional responses. Worship is no exception. When a believer participates in worship with awareness, fully attending to the lyrics, melodies, and intentions behind each act, they are actively shaping the architecture of their mind and heart. Conversely, when worship is mechanical or passive, its formative potential is diminished, and it may even allow subtle patterns of influence to take root without resistance. This is why intentional worship is not simply a matter of discipline. It is an act of empowerment. It is a conscious claim over the formation of one's own character and the direction of one's spiritual life. Each song sung with awareness, each prayer offered with understanding, each gesture performed with devotion becomes a means of aligning inner reality with truth. The act of worship, when engaged fully, is both protective and generative. It shields the heart from subtle compromise while simultaneously cultivating virtues such as humility, courage, and devotion. It is, in essence, an exercise in spiritual agency, a choice to shape oneself deliberately rather than drift passively in response to circumstance or habit. There is also a profound philosophical dimension here. Humans are meaning-making creatures, and our experience is inseparable from the frameworks through which we interpret reality. Worship approached intentionally becomes a lens through which we interpret our lives, our challenges, and our moral responsibilities. It frames our perception in a way that emphasizes connection, purpose, and alignment with the eternal. In this sense, worship is not merely a ritualistic expression. It is a form of cognitive and moral cultivation. By directing our attention, emotion, and intention toward God, we structure not only our actions, but also our understanding of what is meaningful, what is right, and what is enduring. Spiritually, the stakes are high. The enemy, as Dr. Charles Stanley points out, is patient and strategic. He does not always attack overtly. Rather, he often seeks to exploit gaps in attention, lapses in intentionality, and the mechanical repetition of practices that have lost their reflective power. Songs, prayers, and rituals repeated without engagement become vulnerable points, channels through which influence that is not aligned with God's purposes can enter. Intentional worship closes these gaps. It transforms the familiar into a deliberate act of devotion, ensuring that every element of practice reinforces spiritual strength rather than creating openings for compromise. Moreover, intentional worship fosters a sense of unity between thought, emotion, and spirit. It integrates cognitive awareness with heartfelt devotion, producing a holistic experience that engages the whole person. This integration is crucial because partial engagement, where the mind is elsewhere while the body or voice participates, leaves the individual fragmented and susceptible to distraction, doubt, or subtle misalignment. When worship is fully engaged, it cultivates resilience, clarity, and alignment, reinforcing the principles of discernment, reflection, and intentional practice that we have explored in the previous points. The practical implications are clear. Begin with mindfulness. Bring full attention to each song, each prayer, and each act of worship. Reflect on the meaning of the words and melodies and consider how they influence your heart and mind. Align your emotions with intention, allowing your devotion to guide both feeling and thought. Engage in worship with a deliberate posture of humility, openness, and receptivity, recognizing that every act of intentional devotion contributes to the shaping of your character and spiritual resilience. And finally, seek to integrate this intentionality into every aspect of spiritual practice, from study and prayer to community engagement and service, ensuring that your life is consistently aligned with purpose and truth. At its essence, intentional, spirit-led worship is an act of courage and responsibility. It requires effort, reflection, and self-awareness. But it is also profoundly transformative. It converts familiar practices from passive habits into active instruments of formation, strengthening the mind, heart, and soul against compromise while cultivating virtues that endure. By engaging consciously in worship, we claim agency over our spiritual trajectory, fortify our inner life, and align ourselves with the enduring principles of truth and virtue. So as we conclude this reflection, consider this. Every act of worship carries the power to shape your mind, heart, and soul. The difference between singing mechanically and singing with intention is the difference between vulnerability and strength, between passivity and agency, between a life unconsciously influenced and a life consciously aligned with God. Make your worship deliberate. Engage fully. Let every song, every prayer, and every gesture serve as a building block in the architecture of a strong, resilient, and spiritually aligned life. The challenge is simple but profound. Do not let your worship be passive. Let it be conscious. Let it be intentional. And let it be transformative.